Hello, my name is Petra Barnbaum, and I am currently studying a Masters of Teaching Secondary. The following video is made for instructional purposes as a beginner's guide to neuroscience and learning. The brain is the most complex organ in our body and is responsible for everything we do, say, feel, think, or create. The brain is so complex, and the fields associated, such as neuroscience, psychology, and medicine, so vast that it can seem almost too overwhelming to understand. While many mysteries of the brain remain undiscovered, and while an in-depth knowledge of the brain and its functions would require many years of study and research, a basic understanding of the brain is recommended for all owners of the organ. It is especially important knowledge for teachers who wish to better understand how their students learn. This video of under 10 minutes is in no way meant to inform and teach about every facet of neuroscience or to render the listener an expert in the field. It was simply created to be a very basic overview of brain structures, functions, and learning ability. To start with, we will separate the brain into three basic sections: the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the cerebrum. The cerebellum is often referred to as little brain because, like the brain as a whole, it has two distinct hemispheres, the outer portion and the inner portion. The cerebellum is responsible for maintaining balance and coordination. The brainstem is broken up into three main parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The structure of the brainstem is responsible for involuntary movement intrinsic to our survival, such as breathing, maintaining heart rate, and swallowing. The midbrain is specifically associated with maintaining the circadian rhythm, sleep cycle, sensing, and responding to temperature and alertness and motor control. The midbrain is also made up of smaller, more specific areas such as the tegmentum and the tectum, and those structures are made up of smaller subdivisions again. For this video, however, we will not delve further into these regions and their specifics, as this video aims to provide an overview of brain structure and functions rather than an encyclopedic view. The references provided at the end of this video may provide further information and will delve into more complex descriptions. The pons section of the brainstem connects the midbrain and the medulla and enables such activities as chewing, blinking, and facial expression, among others. The medulla, or medulla oblongata, is often referred to as the most important part of the brain because of its essential role in keeping us alive by maintaining bodily homeostasis. That is to say, the medulla is essential for maintaining autonomic functions such as respiration, heart rate, and blood flow. The medulla is also responsible for such activities as sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. The cerebrum accounts for 2/3 of the brain's total weight and consists of the two cerebral hemispheres connected by the corpus callosum. The cerebrum is responsible for higher order thinking, and each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. The 4 lobes of the cerebrum, or cerebral cortex, include the occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision and visual processing, the temporal lobe, which is responsible for auditory processing and memory, the parietal lobe, which is responsible for processing sensory information such as temperature, touch, and pain, as well as having a role in navigation, controlling movement, and orientation, and the frontal lobe, which is responsible for higher order thinking, such as emotional regulation, logical thinking, problem solving, and planning. In essence, the frontal lobe is responsible for what makes you you and what makes me me, personality and executive thinking. The first signs of problems in the area of this area of the brain are thus typically personality changes. Some deeper structures of the brain include the amygdala, notable for the flight or fight response, and other survival mechanisms and implicit emotional reactions. The hippocampus is responsible for memory and is thus especially important in learning. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland are both involved in the production and distribution of hormones. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which releases hormones into the bloodstream. The primary function of the hypothalamus is maintaining homeostasis within the body. To understand how the brain learns, it is first useful to understand how signals are transmitted throughout the brain. The brain is made up of cells called neurons, around 100 billion in fact. These neurons send electrochemical signals throughout the brain through around 100 trillion synaptic connections. The signals that these neurons send are responsible for everything that we do, sense, and think. For example, if you were to touch a hot surface, sensory receptors in your skin would send signals through the peripheral nervous system via nerve fibers into neurons in the central nervous system. The central nervous system refers to the brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system includes all nerves outside of the central nervous system. Once the signal that you have touched something hot reaches the brain, the pain is registered and the brain sends back signals through neurons back into the peripheral nervous system that then tells your hand to retract from the hot object. All of this signaling and messaging and processing happens so quickly you would never notice it happening. Of course, this description of how pain is processed and reacted to in the brain is an overly simplified version of true events, but the point remains true that all sensation and actions are a coordinated effort between the peripheral and central nervous systems, and that neurons are responsible for relaying information throughout the brain. The neuron itself is made up of the following parts: dendrites, which receive signals from other neurons; the body of the cell, which contains the nucleus, which in turn contains the genetic material of the cell; the axon, which the signal travels through, protected by a myelin sheath, which encompasses the axon and acts as an insulator to allow for electrical impulses to be transmitted quickly and efficiently; the nodes of Ranvier, which are periodic gaps in the myelin sheath that are subsequently uninsulated and allow for the diffusion of ions in and out of the neuron to propagate the electrical signal down the axon. The nodes are spaced out, allowing for the electrical signal to jump rapidly from node to node. And finally, the axon terminals or terminal buttons, which send the signal to more neurons or to efferent nerves, which carry information away from the central nervous system and into the peripheral nervous system, allowing for movement. The terminal buttons send signals via neurotransmitters, which travel over the synaptic cleft, the gap between neurons, in little packages called vesicles. These vesicles are then received by receptors in the next neuron's postsynaptic receptors located on its dendrites. There are many types of neurotransmitters, and they can be either excitatory or inhibitory. If enough excitatory neurotransmitters are received by the postsynaptic receptors, this will result in the neuron carrying an action potential, which triggers the release of new neurotransmitters through to a new neuron. Essentially, one neuron sends signals that activate the next neuron to send signals to activate the next neuron, and so forth until the signal reaches the peripheral nervous system and creates an action, or until more inhibitory neurotransmitters are released than excitatory ones, and this causes the next neuron line not to fire a new action potential. So how does all of this complicated signaling within the brain relate to learning? Learning physically changes your brain. When we learn something new, it creates new neural pathways and connections within the brain, and sometimes even new neurons. The more we study something or try to memorize it, the stronger the pathways become. Neuroplasticity refers to the ability of the brain to adapt and change through learning. By activating certain pathways more frequently, usually through study in the case of school learning, the synaptic connections become stronger and the neurons are more likely to fire in the future. Unfortunately, while constantly activating neural pathways strengthens connections, the reverse is also true. If you don't activate certain pathways enough, the connections can weaken or even disappear, making you forget previous knowledge or even skills such as second languages. In conclusion, the implications of neuroscience for teaching and learning are great, as we must understand how the brain and learning works in order to achieve better student outcomes. Thank you.